My name is Robert Meeropol, but I was born Robert Rosenberg. I am the younger son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. I was adopted by Abel and Ann Meeropol after my birth parents were executed. My birth parents are the defendants in the famous Rosenberg case. They were charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. More particularly, in the press, it was discussed that they were charged with stealing the secret of the atomic bomb and giving it to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, at the height of the McCarthy period. This happened, the arrest took place when I was 3, the execution took place when I was 6. And I'm now in my 70s, and I am an attorney. I'm a retired attorney, but I can say that I'm the only attorney in the United States to have had both their parents executed. And so I have a lot to say about the death penalty and other matters. I do want to say just briefly my view of my parents' case, because I don't want there to be any misconceptions. I believe neither my parents did the thing they were killed for, that is, steal the secret of the atomic bomb. My father, however, the evidence is overwhelming that he was involved in espionage during the 1940s, that he and a group of young men took military-industrial information and material from the United States during World War II and gave it to the Soviet Union in order to help them defeat the Nazis. So my father was guilty, but not of atomic espionage, of military-industrial espionage, and my mother, Ethel, was charged merely to coerce him to cooperate. And so I believe my mother was not a spy. Can I prove that she's totally and completely innocent of not being involved in a secret conspiracy or being involved in a secret conspiracy? I can't prove that. But I can show that the evidence presented against her at trial was oral testimony given by 2 witnesses, both of whom perjured themselves, and that I can prove that, and therefore that her conviction was based upon false evidence and should not stand. I was a little kid. I knew growing up when they were still alive but in prison that something bad was happening, that there was us and there was them. I didn't know who we were and who they were, but they were powerful and we were weak, and somehow something strange had happened that took my parents away. It was related to my parents, and that if we didn't keep quiet about and kind of keep our heads down and not make a lot of noise, then things could get even worse. And then, of course, they did, because my parents were killed. So I never didn't know, to use the double negative. I always knew that something had happened, but I didn't really understand it. As a 6-year-old, my brother said even after my parents' execution, there were times when I said, when are we going to go visit Mommy and Daddy in prison? And he would have to remind me that they'd been killed. And I think that as a 6-year-old, I still had that sort of magical thinking. You know, when you're a little kid, you believe that if you really, really want something to happen, it can happen just because you really want it. Well, of course, that's not true. It doesn't work that way. But I think I was still at that stage of development at that point. By the time 1954 rolled around, though, I knew. I can't tell you when I knew and exactly how I knew, but I knew. And, you know, growing up with adoptive parents and having my name changed, it was a lot of protection. And so I also knew not to talk about it. So I grew up a relatively normal existence after that, because my name had been changed and the Rosenberg case wasn't discussed. That doesn't mean that we kept it a secret from everybody. It doesn't mean that my adoptive parents, Abel and Ann Meeropol, wouldn't answer my questions. They did. But it meant that most of the time I did what other kids did growing up. So it wasn't until I went to law school and began to really investigate my parents' case on my own that I began to develop a more nuanced view. I believed as a child, I was told by everybody who I loved and who was around me that my parents were innocent, so I believed that. But I came over time to realize that it was more complicated than that. When they were first arrested, and before the trial, people felt that it would be bad for us to see my parents in prison, and that they might win the trial and come home. So we didn't see them for over a year. But then after they were convicted and it was clear that the best news was that they were going to be in prison, then we started visiting them. So we started visiting them. They were arrested in the summer of 1950. We started visiting them at the end of the summer of 51. And we probably had about a dozen visits between then and June of 1953 when they were killed. And that's really what I remember of my parents. If it were not for those parents' prison visits, I really would have virtually no memory of them at all. In the last week of my parents' lives, a new argument was presented, and the execution was stayed. And the Supreme Court recessed for the summer. They were going to schedule to be executed on Thursday, June 18th. When Justice Douglas issued his stay, it caused such a furor that the Supreme Court was reconvened in special session for the first time in our history, and they reset the execution for Friday, June 19th. Okay? Then the lawyers played their final card. Prisoners get executed at 11 p.m. The lawyers noted that would be after the start of the Sabbath. It would be a desecration of the Sabbath to have an execution take place during the Sabbath. So they asked for it to be put off until Monday. And the Department of Prisons said, okay, we won't execute them on the Sabbath, and they moved the execution forward to 1 minute before sundown on Friday. But the execution of my mother, who went second, failed. And they had to kill her. They had to do it twice, and it was after sundown when she was executed. All the prosecuting attorneys were Jewish except for one, who had a Jewish-sounding name, by the way. James Kilsheimer was not Jewish. The judge was Jewish, but all Jews were taken off. Were in New York City were removed from the jury. So no Jews on the jury. All the prosecutors, but one being Jewish, and the judge being Jewish. And then the judge, in order to demonstrate his patriotism and the fact that he was not going to elevate his connection to Jews over his connection to the United States, felt compelled to give a death sentence in order to prove his loyalty. So in this sort of convoluted way, anti-Semitism played this rather subtle role in my parents' case. Now, that's within the courtroom. J. Edgar Hoover was a well-known anti-Semite and was even quoted as saying, you know, the Soviet Union is not going to recruit spies from Anglo-Saxons. They're going to look for others, and of course the others were the Jews. Having both my parents executed, you would think, oh, of course he's against the death penalty. But from my perspective as a young person when I was growing up, I felt that my parents had been murdered. They'd been murdered by the judge. They'd been murdered by the prosecutors. And I was in favor of the death penalty for them. I thought it would be perfectly fine. As a teenager, I used to have fantasies about them being called before a court and being sentenced for their crimes. It wasn't until I went to law school, and I didn't go right to law school. I had a checkered career. I started out going to be an anthropology professor and taught at college for a few years, decided that wasn't for me. Ultimately went to law school when I was in my 30s. And when I got to law school, what you do in law school, you study cases. And the more cases I studied, the more I realized the system was imperfect. That, you know, we made mistakes. There were all sorts of mistakes being made. And the problem with capital punishment is it requires perfection. Unless you can create a perfect system, it is inevitable that you will execute someone who's not guilty. And realizing how imperfect our legal system was, I found it unacceptable and logically unacceptable that we could institute a punishment that we could not correct. Now, you sentence someone to life in prison, for instance, and he presents new evidence or she presents new evidence, you can't, and they can get out of prison. You can't give them back the years they've lost, though you can compensate them in some other ways, but at least they can go back to where they were. Once you execute someone, you can't say whoops and take it back. So I realized that. And beyond that, I also realized that the death penalty, well, there's lots of reasons. That's the logical reason. I think also there's a political reason, and that is, I think of it from the perspective of a democracy. In a democracy, at least in theory, the people are sovereign, not the king, not the courts, not the president, but the people. Giving the government the power of life and death is a denial of, or it's an abdication, that's a better word. It's an abdication of your sovereignty. You are giving the state that power. And that's a power that should be retained by the people. So I think that's sort of that may seem like a sort of arcane or wonky argument, but I think it's actually very important politically, and it's not one that's not used that much. There are also moral and religious arguments. I mean, depending upon what your religion is. As a secular person, I respect those beliefs, but the way I look at it is I view capital punishment as a human rights abuse. That if you actually look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as signed by the United Nations, as originally formulated by Eleanor Roosevelt and others, the very first right is the right to life. And it makes sense that that's the very first right to be articulated, because if you don't have that right, none of the other rights mean anything. So I see human rights as, as very important to this, and the capital punishment as a human rights abuse. And that's immoral. So, there's logical, political, and moral reasons to be opposed to the death penalty. And I don't think I've really covered all the territory even by saying that. For a number of years, I was a member of a group called Murder Victims' Families for Human Rights. Now, this included people whose families had been executed, as well as people who had relatives murdered. And within that group, one of the main arguments was that we would want to substitute life without the possibility of parole for capital punishment as a more humane alternative. The problem with that was there was a tension within the group in that I was friendly with people who'd had family members murdered. And I remember one woman who had her sister was murdered by a young man, and who was in prison, and who was not remorseful at all. And she was opposed to the death penalty, and she'd say, I'm opposed to the death penalty. I don't want him to be executed, but I don't want him ever released from prison. I don't want him walking the streets in my town. So I'm in favor of that alternative. But there were other people within the group who felt that, well, switching from death penalty to life without the possibility of parole was just the first step in the direction of abolishing the death penalty and life without the possibility of parole. And I was sympathetic to that position because people change. an 18-year-old murderer could be a 45-year-old who would be actually a productive, positive member of society. We just don't know. We can't know that at the time. And so, but I could see this woman's point of view. So I found myself on both sides, and I think that there are powerful arguments in both directions. But we also have to put it within the larger context, and that is, what's the prison system like? You know, if it's overcrowded and it's inhumane, then no matter what you do, it's not good. And that brings me back to capital punishment too, because I think that one of the things that I've learned is a very simple thing, that two wrongs don't make a right. Now we tell that to our kids, but we don't practice it as adults. So you can't solve the wrong of a murder by doing something that's also wrong. You can only figure out the only way you can negate that is with something positive to balance it. When I went to law school and started studying the criminal justice system, I realized that we make mistakes, and human beings all make mistakes. We're incapable of creating a perfect system. And the death penalty requires perfection because you can't take it back once you do it. Now, if you look at my parents' case, it's actually generally believed now that neither of my parents should have been executed, that it was the war hysteria, the Korean War was going on, the fear of atomic weapons, the idea that my parents somehow stole a secret that could lead to the destruction of our entire country. That all seemed to justify the death penalty. But when you actually look at the facts of the case, and let's focus on my mother, one of the things we've learned, and it's taken a long time to learn this, is that my parents were accused of being KGB agents who worked with the Soviet spies to steal atomic secrets. Well, what we now know from our government's and the Russian government's own files is that the KGB gave all its agents code names. My father, who worked for them, did have a code name. So did my parents' chief accusers, David and Ruth Greenglass. Ethel Rosenberg was never given a code name. And that's because the KGB did not consider her an agent. But the jury didn't know that. Jury didn't know all those facts. All they knew was the scare tactics that the government employed. Now, I can talk about other details, but it seems to me that the fact that our government executed someone they claimed to be an atomic spy for the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union itself didn't consider her their spy, that should be more than enough to give people pause. In my parents' case, the whole case was built upon the testimony of people who were offered deals if they gave that testimony. So that it basically happened to my parents at first. It wasn't just the witnesses against them. They were told that if you cooperate, then Julius, you won't get a death sentence. You'll go to prison. And Ethel, you can stay home and take care of your children. So there was an immediate incentive for them to cooperate. And cooperate meant say what the government wanted you to say. And in my parents' case, they would have had to admit to doing something they didn't do, which was steal the secret of the atomic bomb. They couldn't just, Julius couldn't say, well, no, I'm a military industrial spy. Give me 15 years in prison. That wasn't going to be acceptable. But it also involved my parents' chief accusers, David Greenglass and his wife, Ruth Greenglass. They were offered the same deal. They were told, if you cooperate, David, you will get a prison sentence. He was given a 15-year prison sentence. He served 10 and then was released on parole. And Ruth Greenglass got up on the witness stand and said, I helped steal the secret of the atomic bomb, and she was never indicted and never spent a day in prison. My mother got up on the witness stand and said I wasn't involved, and she was executed. And Ruth Greenglass, the KGB gave her a code name. Ethel Rosenberg, the KGB gave her no code name. So you can see how the incentive to help yourself can generate false testimony. In my parents' case, what it really generated was blame shifting. The Greenglasses actually took stuff that they did and they put it on my parents. And of course, that kind of, particularly in a conspiracy case, and this is a real important thought. When you have a conspiracy case, it's credibility. It's, in other words, a conspiracy case is a case about groups of people planning to take actions. That means that it's all about secret discussions. It's not about factual, physical evidence so much as about conversation and planning. Well, when you have conversation and planning, who's the jury going to believe? One set of witnesses who said, no, we didn't do it. The other set who said, yes, we did. It's all a question of credibility. And when you incentivize people to lie, you end up having the jury believe the people who are the best liars. It is a real problem. And at the same time, I think but it's not simple, because there are circumstances in which if you don't get people to cooperate, you don't have any case at all.